Cool. So my talk has a tendency to run kind of long, so I'm going to dive right in and get started. My name is Nara Kasbergen. I'm a full stack developer at NPR, and I'm going to be talking about NPR's 1 year with Angular. And I had a couple questions already, and some people have picked up on this, that when I say 1 year with Angular, I really mean 1 year with Angular version 2. But you may or may not have heard, Angular is going through a little bit of a rebranding campaign right now, kind of focused on this idea. This is a quote from Igor Minar, one of the tech leads on the project, where the idea is no matter which version we're talking about, it's really all just Angular. I'm guessing that there's a kind of a wealth of experience with Angular in this room. Some of you might be, very familiar with the newer versions. Some people might be AngularJS developers who have not touched the newer versions. And I'm guessing there's probably some people in the room who have never touched Angular in their life. So kind of to get everyone on the same page and to explain why the naming kind of matters, I'm going to briefly run through the history, which will really kind of like explain why we got where we are today and what the conversations about Angular are currently. And so the story really starts in 2009. Miško Hevry and his colleague Adam Abrams started a project that at the time they called Get Angular at a company called BratTech LLC. One of the core ideas was to bring the kind of methodology of back-end testing to a front-end JavaScript framework. So they're playing around with it. They realized this is pretty cool. I think we've got something here. But the future is probably best as an open source library. We don't want to make it proprietary software. Around the same time, Miško started a job at Google working on Google Feedback, which had already been around for a couple years. The code base was huge and just getting bigger all the time. It was getting harder and harder to write and maintain the tests. And so at a certain point, he walked up to his manager and said, I have a proposal for you. I want to rewrite the entire Google Feedback front-end code base using our Get Angular project. And I can promise that I can make the code base smaller, increase our test coverage, and make it easier to maintain in the future. And I'm going to do it all in 2 weeks. So he managed to do all of those things, except it took him 3 weeks. But the management at Google was still incredibly impressed. They went up to their execs and they said, there's this project, this open source library. We think it has a bright future. And so Google decided to bring it in-house. They rebranded it as AngularJS. And about a year later, October 2010, they kind of released their first public version, version 0.9, to kind of indicate that they thought they were close to a 1.0 release, but they were also ready for the community to start kind of contributing more feedback. So a lot of people perked up and were interested, but they were also a little bit hesitant because version 0.9 might indicate that there's, a little bit of churn still coming. And so a couple years later, June 14th, 2012, AngularJS version 1.0 was released. And that's really when everyone kind of perked up and said, this is a big deal and we're going to start paying attention. Because this really was the height of the JavaScript framework wars, or at least the first iteration, when it really was Backbone versus Ember versus Knockout. And then Angular was obviously kind of the new kid on the scene, and it was backed by a big company, Google, so everyone was like, wow, this is a huge deal. And so there was an immediate influx of commentary and people contributing feedback. And so they started kind of releasing much more frequently. And July 26, 2012, they came out with a blog post that said, we've been listening to the feedback that everybody gave, and we're going to start making some significant changes for version 1.2, and we're targeting release in early to mid-September 2012. And they laid out some of their ideas, and by kind of today's semantic versioning standards, what they were talking about probably would have been version 2.0. But that was one of those things that people back then, they were kind of scared to do. And so obviously, again, because they were proposing some breaking changes, there was quite a bit of angst around what that was actually going to mean for the people who had, in the meantime, already started adopting and writing production apps in Angular. So instead of early to mid-September 2012, it actually took until November 8th, 2013 to come out with version 1.2 and something that everyone was happy with, that had taken all of this feedback into account. So this was kind of in the Angular community, I think kind of a big sigh of relief moment. We went through kind of a difficult year and a half together, but we all worked together. We came out with something that we're all happy with, which is why the next phase, again, caused quite a bit of angst. Just 5 months later, March 18th, 2014, the AngularJS team announced on their blog that they had begun work on Angular 2.0, a complete from the ground up redesign. They hadn't necessarily started coding yet. It was a lot of kind of written proposals, some whiteboarding, kind of early validation of ideas. And there was no prediction yet about how this is going to kind of relate to Angular 1.0, but a lot of people picked up on the fact that they were kind of starting from scratch, which might have, implications for what future Angular application development might look like. And so the internet does what the internet does and kind of freaked out. And to really highlight why this is important to a lot of people, we're talking about this period right now when Angular had finally kind of like significantly overtaken all other frameworks in terms of interest. People had really bought into it, were starting to write a ton of production apps in Angular, and now they're talking about changing everything. Then October 2014, to kind of really truly cement everyone's fears, at the NG Europe conference, the Angular team announced that the Angular 2.0 API would not be backwards compatible with AngularJS 1.x. So the internet really exploded, and this was a time when like you could go on Hacker News or Reddit almost any given point in time and find a lot of angry threads. In the meantime, development had begun. It was kind of in a quiet phase. February 10th, 2015, the first alpha release of Angular 2 was quietly published on NPM. But in the meantime, the team at Google was actively listening to feedback. And one of the things that they had picked up on was people were very much like, we're not going to rewrite our entire app to Angular 2. So at NGConf in Vegas on March 5th, 2015, they announced that the upcoming AngularJS version 1.5 releases were going to focus on creating a bit of a migration path to Angular 2. So it wasn't necessarily going to be that you could just drop in Angular 2 in your app and everything would be able to work, but they were giving you the tools to start writing in Angular 2 within Angular version 1.5 to help you migrate in the future. And another thing that they fixed later that year, originally when they announced Angular 2, they said, we're really dropping support for older browsers because it's what is keeping back a lot of web technology development nowadays. But after talking to the community, they realized at the very least they could support IE9, Android 4.1, and iOS 7 without too much extra like bloat in the code base and without too much kind of loss of features as a result. So they walked back those comments in October. And so everyone kind of calmed down. December 15th, 2015, just a couple of months later, Angular 2 reached beta. And so obviously that's when a lot of people kind of perked up and said, okay, this is really happening. And May 6th, 2016, Angular 2 reached release candidate. So again, this is another one of those phases where a lot of people kind of said, okay, this is when we have to really start giving feedback because this is probably our last chance to make sure that whatever ideas that we have for this version, like make it into the final version. And one of the things that they got the most feedback about was a part of the framework called the router. The first version that they came out with had been around since the beta days, and they got feedback from the community that said, like, I don't think this is really going to work for XYZ reasons. So they said, okay, went back to the drawing board, rewrote the entire thing, and brought it back to the community and said, is this what you need? And everyone said, it's closer, but not quite there. So they went back to the drawing board and did everything again a third time. And so on June 9th, 2016, they announced the alpha release of version 3 of the router, because every part of the Angular framework at this point is its own NPM package. So the router was now at v3 in response to the feedback they had gotten. And that might seem like a tiny detail, and I'll explain in just a little bit why this matters. September 14th, 2016, Angular version 2.0 final was released. And just a couple weeks later at Angular Connect in London, the Angular team announced that all future Angular releases will follow semantic versioning. This wasn't really new news at the time, but it was the first time that they had kind of officially come out and stated, like, this is the path forward. This is a slide from their presentation that they made, where the whole idea is now patch releases are bug fixes, minor releases are always going to be backwards compatible, and anything that has any kind of incompatible breaking changes is going to be a major release. And the thing that they announced is what they're hoping to do is come out with a new major release every 6 months. Because the whole goal was, we want to keep up with technology as it evolves. And we think we can actually make that easier by coming out with these breaking changes a little bit more regularly. So it's not a huge influx at a time, so we don't have to come back and rewrite the entire framework all over again. And so at the time they said, okay, so this means that we are gearing up for an Angular 3 release in probably March 2017. But they kind of changed their minds about that. On December 9th, 2016, at the NGBE conference in Belgium, Igor Minar announced that the next version of Angular will be 4, not 3, because of the router being at v3 already. And this is kind of what that looked like. What had happened was, again, like all the parts of the framework are their own NPM packages now, but they had always kept the numbering consistent. So they were all at the time at version 2.3, except for the router, which was at version 3.3. The minor and patch versions were still the same between these two, but the major version was different. So that obviously led to some confusion. What does that mean when Angular 3 comes out? Because the router will still have to change. Will the router always be one version ahead of the rest of the framework? And they decided, you know what, it's probably just easier to kind of wipe the slate clean and make everything go to 4. Windows went from 8 to 10, okay, PHP went from 5 to 7, like, it's kind of weird in the beginning, but everyone kind of gets over it after a few months. So it'll feel awkward for a few months, and then everyone will get used to it. By the time we get to Angular 5, everyone will have forgotten, hopefully, that this happened. And so March 23rd, 2017, Angular version 4 final was released just a couple weeks ago. And so that's where this idea comes from, where it's all just Angular. We're trying to move away from talking about specific Angular versions, because the core idea at the end of the day is it's the framework that you already love. It's just powered now by the latest technology. And there have been a lot of questions, obviously, about whether this whole rewrite was truly necessary. And my answer to that is to remember that AngularJS got its start in 2009. So at the time, jQuery was still considered to be the gold standard of front-end development. And one of the reasons why Angular was popular in the beginning was that it was basically built on top of jQuery, and it was compatible right off the bat with all of your existing jQuery plugins and other jQuery tools that you were already using. Also at the time, smartphone adoption in the US was still at 25%, and mobile browser technology was in its infancy. And one of the things that happened over time with AngularJS, the old version, is that people realized that the performance on mobile just wasn't as good as they thought it would be. That's again because their assumptions when they were building it have kind of had to change over time. And also just to kind of emphasize how long ago this truly was in terms of like web technology development, ES5 was released in December 2009. I think a lot of us in this room who are JavaScript developers are probably working in ES6 now, maybe even bringing in some ES7. So to think that there were like days before ES5 is almost like mind-blowing. And newer technology like web components were not even on the radar yet. So really, that's what the core changes of V2 and the newer versions are really all about, is that we essentially, Angular dropped jQuery and now uses a virtual DOM to render HTML. And the usage of a virtual DOM also impacts how Angular does change detection under the hood. And this change to change detection is really what makes it so much more performant, especially on mobile devices and anything that doesn't have like a very advanced browser. And also, AngularJS used to have these things called controllers and directives. These have now been replaced by components, which are intended to be compatible with the web components of the not-so-distant future. And another thing that I think is important to think about is why people used and loved AngularJS. The big reason that I alluded to earlier is that it made front-end testing so much easier and more accessible than any framework ever had before. Especially because it's philosophy that everything is dependency injected, so that makes it like a breeze to write unit tests for everything. Along with that, it was kind of touted as like the all-in-one framework that kind of gives you everything that you need, so you don't have to go shopping around for all of the other libraries for different parts of the framework that don't come with this package. And as a result, it also scaled very well to large enterprise-grade projects. So it was very popular, and frankly, I think one of the biggest deals was the Google seal of confidence. The fact that Google feels comfortable putting their name on this. For a lot of people who are very hesitant about adopting new technology, this was a huge deal. So those are all still valid reasons to use and love a framework, and Angular from versions 2 and up still reflects all of those exact same values. The only thing that has changed is the underlying technology. So that kind of brings us to where we are today, and now I'll talk about 1 year with Angular at NPR. And that story really starts with this. This is what you used to see up until a little over a year ago when you went to one.npr.org. This is our web version of NPR One. For those of you who don't know, NPR One is NPR's mobile app, primarily for iOS, Android, and Windows Mobile. The whole idea is that we're trying to reimagine public radio in the digital age. So you can still listen to the same kind of NPR programming that you love, a lot of short news segments, but also long-form podcasts. But you can now take advantage of modern technology, like being able to skip pieces that you're not interested in or mark things as interesting. save them for later, and share them with your friends. And so we've pretty much always had a web version, but it had kind of fallen into a state of neglect after a while. This original version had been around since basically the beginning. It was built in jQuery and Knockout. And the people who had worked on the original version had since kind of moved on from NPR and had turned into the sort of thing where anytime that maintenance on this was needed, the rest of the team was kind of scrambling to figure out like how this is built and like what part of the code needed to be updated. There were no unit tests either. And so at a certain point there was a proposal to add maybe a couple new features and to do a design refresh because the design patterns for NPR1 had evolved over time. And the team kind of came back and said, you know, frankly, if we're going to do that, we should probably just wipe the slate clean and start from scratch, because at this point, most of us aren't familiar with this code. It's too hard to work with what's already here. Let's just start from scratch. And so that idea was approved, and so we started kind of shopping around for a technology stack. And around the time when we were doing that, a different team was working on this project right here, what you see in the right rail here. This is NPR's persistent player, which launched right around a year ago as well. So the whole idea for this is that this player will keep playing regardless of where you navigate on the site, so you can still keep listening to the same story. So for this, they also wanted to use, you know, all of the great HTML5 audio features and a modern JavaScript development stack. But the restriction for the team working on this was that npr.org as a whole is a very large, old, sprawling code base, and it was not reasonable for them to rewrite the entire thing from scratch. So they really needed to use something where they could pick off small pieces and kind of modernize the JavaScript. And so they picked React, which makes perfect sense for what they were trying to do. And so that put a little bit of pressure on us to also use React. And we thought about it, we seriously considered it, but we also felt like they're working with a very different set of requirements than we are. They're working with a lot of legacy code. We actually have the opportunity to start from scratch. And so we proposed using Angular for the rebuild of the web app, which definitely caused some waves, but we were able to justify it by saying, like, you know, this is our opportunity to start a project from scratch. This actually almost never happens at NPR. Almost any other project, we're always working with legacy code. So we have a lot of options that we don't usually have. And because the NPR1 web app is kind of its own self-contained unit, it doesn't share any code with the rest of npr.org, that really lends itself well to an all-in-one framework that gives you everything that you need. So Angular was kind of the obvious solution for that. The other thing is we were a very small team. There were only 2 developers, 1 designer, and a product manager. We had no embedded QA resource on the team. So for us, achieving a very high level of test coverage to validate that the project was actually doing what we thought it would was critical as well, which meant that we really wanted a framework that was built with testing in mind. And kind of along with that, we just, over time, realized that we really don't believe in one framework to rule them all. We felt like every use case might have like a different solution, and that's perfectly okay. And frankly, like a lot of the research that we did led us to conclude that React and Angular, and here I truly mean like the newer versions of Angular, share many of the same core ideas, like using a virtual DOM and virtual DOM diffing for change detection and things like that. And so we had a hypothesis that there's a place in every team stack for both React and Angular, and this was probably one of our only opportunities to test that out. And so it all started January 31st, 2016. I pushed the first commit to our private repo for the NPR1 web app. And exactly 2 months later, on March 31st, 2016, we launched. And I believe this is when Angular 2 was still in beta 15. So, and this is what it looked like. This was a couple months, taken a couple months after launch, after we had added a couple features. But this was the whole idea. Like I said, we wanted to do a design refresh to make it consistent with the design and UX patterns being used in the mobile app, but at the same time also take advantage of some of like the real estate on a desktop browser that we don't have in other places. So there's like full images and things like that to add a little bit more visual interest. But possibly the thing that we're most proud of is that at launch and ever since, we have been able to maintain 100% unit test coverage. We've almost never been able to do that with any of our projects. So again, this is like a huge milestone for us. And we have a full suite of end-to-end tests that are written using Protractor. Protractor is an end-to-end testing framework for Angular that's essentially a wrapper around Selenium and WebDriver.js that makes it really easy for developers to write end-to-end tests because you just use Jasmine or Mocha, the same tools that you already use to write unit tests. And this is something at NPR where, like, for past projects, if we had wanted to do this, we would have had to bring in like a QA automation engineer to write these kinds of tests because no one else had experience doing this. So for the 2 developers on the team to be able to write their own end-to-end tests, again, was seen as like a huge win. So how did we do it? So again, because I don't know like everyone's Angular experience in the room, I'm going to quickly run through kind of the core components of an Angular app. And so for Angular, the newer versions, there's really only 3 main parts of your app. They're components, injectables, and ng modules. Technically, there are also pipes, but those are kind of purely optional, so I won't talk about those in depth. But what I want to highlight here is how short and simple this list is compared to AngularJS. For those of you who use that, AngularJS had controllers and directives, and then if you're using version 1.5 and up, it also has components. And the services and factories and models and constants and values and configs and modules and filters. So those are a lot of things, and I think one of the biggest learning curves for AngularJS was figuring out when to use which of those things. So obviously that's been greatly simplified by really only reducing it down to 3 things. And so this is what a component looks like. This is a very simple example from the Angular website. But the whole idea is that there's really only 2 parts to this. One is an ES6 class, which here is called app component, and then there's an annotation at components. For those of you coming from the Java world, seeing annotation in JavaScript might look a little weird, but the whole idea here is that it's basically just metadata that you're attaching to the JavaScript class. And so there's a couple other things that you can list here, but there's really normally only 2 things. There's the HTML selector that you're going to use, and then the template to put inside it. For anyone coming from AngularJS who sees this and does a little bit of a double take, it is entirely still possible to put your templates in their own separate files if that's what you prefer. Some people really came to like that because you might have front-end developers who don't necessarily write JavaScript who want to be able to manipulate templates without the risk of screwing up JavaScript code. You can totally still do that, and in that case what you would do is you would replace the template here with template URL, and instead of having this hard-coded template here, you would just have a string that's a relative path to where that template file is located. But what people have come to kind of adopt more often now in the Angular world is to put the templates inline in the JavaScript. And some of that is maybe a little bit of the conventions that other frameworks are following. But for me, I've come to prefer this mostly because what I have found is that with this component structure, it's very easy to write very small components that sometimes only have like 3 lines of HTML. So putting those in their own separate template files often feels like overkill. And so having your templates in line with the components, in that case, just feels like it's much simpler and easier to maintain. And the big change from AngularJS, in AngularJS, there was this whole idea of scope, and if you wanted something to be accessible from your template, you had to manually add it to scope. And so the simplified idea here is that anything that's basically a public property on the component is accessible from the template. So this is where the title comes from. It just comes from having set this.title, and hero comes from having set this.hero. So really super simple, straightforward. This is an ng module. This is even simpler. Modules are always just an empty class with an @ng module annotation. And again, this is basically just metadata. The whole point of this is basically just to group parts of your code together that are supposed to be kind of self-contained units that you package together for use in other parts of your app. So you kind of declare what other outside modules you want this part of the code to be able to take advantage of. Tell it like what the parts of your app are, and then the bootstrap is really kind of what kicks off the Angular magic to render stuff on the screen. This is something that like usually you'll probably end up like copying from a tutorial, and then you'll modify it every time that you add a file, and other than that you won't really touch it or think about it too hard. So those are fairly simple. And then this is an injectable, which is perhaps the most simple of all, in the sense that an injectable is basically any class that's not a component, and then you just add the @injectable annotation to it. So it can kind of be whatever you want it to be. This particular example from the Angular website called Hero Service is in kind of like faking out an API a little bit. The whole idea here is that you have this array which you're returning as a promise, so it resolves asynchronously. And you may have picked up on the fact that it's called hero service, even though it's an injectable. So for those of you coming from the AngularJS world, injectables basically are the replacement for the concept of services in AngularJS. And services were very widely used in the original AngularJS community, and people really loved it because this is really what helps people understand the importance of dependency injection and making code that's testable, because the whole idea is that you take out all of the business logic from your components or controllers that are not directly responsible for updating a view, and you put it in a service, and that makes your code much more unit testable. So the community really liked this, and so you'll probably continue to see people call things services, even though now the framework calls them injectables. So that kind of leads into structuring your project. Angular as a community has been very kind of passionate about the whole idea of style guides and best practices. And the good news about the newer versions of Angular is that that philosophy for Angular really hasn't changed. So one thing that people with AngularJS did originally is that when the framework first came out, they would do things like they would put all of their directives in a folder called directives and all of their filters in a folder called filters. And then over time, they realized like it doesn't really make sense to structure your project this way. So what they recommended that you do is group everything by feature, not by function. And so even in Angular now, if you have, for example, a part of your site called that's a profile, you would create a profile folder and you would put your profile component and profile service inside of there. The introduction of the ng module also kind of helps enforce that pattern and make you think about which parts of the code belong together as well. And one thing that you'll probably see is that a common Angular convention is to include the type of the class and the file name. So you'll have profile.component, profile.service, profile.module, and then .js or .ts depending on what you're using. And so that kind of leads me right into, frankly, I think one of the hardest parts of starting an Angular project is that you have a few decisions that you have to make up front. And sometimes it may kind of feel like you have imperfect information when it comes to making those decisions. So the things that you really have to decide on are which flavor of JavaScript are you going to use, ES5, ES6, or TypeScript? Then which build system are you going to use, System.js, JSPM, Webpack, or Browserify? Will you attempt to use RxJS or not? And finally, how will you manage application state? So for us, we picked ES6 over TypeScript, and this was something that we really kind of scratched our heads about for a long time, and it wasn't really easy. The Angular community is really kind of pushing TypeScript. It's not prescribed. Like I said, you have choices, but that's really what they recommend. And we wanted to, but we felt like it was a little bit of a bridge too far because nobody else in our department was using TypeScript, and it didn't seem likely that anybody was going to start using it anytime soon. And because we were a kind of a small self-contained team, we did want to make sure that all of the other developers not on our team could read and understand our code and feel empowered to participate in code reviews and be able to help maintain the app in the future. We also thought that the whole part of setting up TypeScript would be kind of hard, but we didn't realize that in order to use ES6, like there's still a ton of Babel plugins that you have to bring in, so it's kind of a setup headache either way. And then finally, at the time when we were making the decision, there weren't any features that were only limited to your using TypeScript. So we felt like, well, if there's no benefits necessarily that we get from using TypeScript other than the fact that the Angular team is pushing it and there's more documentation, ES6 is a better choice. But then over the summer, while Angular was in the release candidate stage, they announced a new feature called ahead of time compilation, which is kind of a difficult concept that I don't have time to explain in depth today. But the whole idea is that normally when you render a single page web app, what usually happens is you wait until the time when the browser renders the web app to make a lot of decisions about what shows up on the screen. And that's really what causes kind of like a drop in performance, both because you're doing a lot of like CPU computation to determine what's on the screen, and also because it increases your payload size as well. But if you can take advantage of the ability to kind of make predictions about, there are certain logic tasks maybe that you don't necessarily need because you already know what you need to do in order to make everything render on the screen at load time. There's a lot of code that can be removed that way or simplified. And the trick here is this has to happen at a time when the code is compiled. So normally if you're using ES5 or ES6, you're transpiling, but you're not compiling. TypeScript, however, does actually compile your code and has the power to make those decisions. So as a result, ahead of time compilation is TypeScript only. And so for us, like frankly, if we had known this, we probably would have picked TypeScript. But that's just, you know, the consequence, I guess, of adopting Angular when it was still in beta. So for you, I think to me, I would say like there's no single answer. I would say like maybe 90% of the time nowadays you probably want to use TypeScript, both because there's much better documentation and because there are features like ahead of time compilation. I would say use ES5 only if you've got a ton of legacy code to migrate or if there are clear infrastructure barriers. Even then, remember that you can still use ES5 code within an ES6 or even a TypeScript app. It's all still valid. So I would say like really only use ES5 if using something like Webpack or even like Grunt or Gulp with Babel is just completely out of the question. And I really hope that's not the case. And I would say, again, use ES6 only if you're working with other teams using ES6 and you're really trying to do a lot of collaboration and code sharing. But again, ES6 is still valid within TypeScript, so 90% of the time you probably want to use TypeScript. As far as build systems go, we tried System.js, which was the only option really recommended by Angular at the time when we were doing this. But the documentation was pretty poor. It's gotten a lot better since then. But in particular, what we struggled with is how to bring in some third-party modules. There were no good examples of how to do that. And what they usually recommend if you're going to go that route is to use an extension of System.js called JSPM. But JSPM is fairly complex. No one on the team had experience doing that, so we didn't really feel comfortable with it. And then there's also Browserify, which we had certainly heard about. It's been around for a long time, but again, like no one had actually used it. And the team using React had experience using Webpack. That's what they were using for their project. So we figured if System.js is not working, Webpack is by far the best choice for us because at least there's other people in the department who can help us out if we get stuck. And it worked out pretty well. I will say that there's two things. One is that if you're just trying to work through the Angular tutorials, some of them still use System.js, and like purely for working through the tutorials, System.js is perfectly fine. Don't bother with setting up Webpack for just going through a tutorial project. And the other good thing is that if you're just getting ready to start an Angular project now, you don't even necessarily have to worry about this choice so much. Because there's this tool now called the Angular CLI, this command line interface that basically will allow you to just type in on the command line, Angular CI create app, that sets up an Angular project for you, including a full build system with Webpack. So it does all the configuration for you and kind of leaves you to not have to worry about that headache part of the process. So this is something that, again, was not here a year ago when we were building our app, and I'm very jealous of everyone who is only just now starting out with Angular today, because you have this great tool available to you. And that kind of brings me to RxJS. So RxJS, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. The Rx here stands for Reactive Extensions, and it's actually a suite of libraries for different programming languages. I believe someone else might be giving a talk later on RxJava. So RxJS is obviously the Reactive Extensions project for JavaScript. And the core idea here is really to start thinking about data that moves through your app as a series of asynchronous events. And you want those asynchronous events to be able to have predictable outcomes no matter how often those events happen. So they might happen like in short bursts or spaced out over time, and you don't know maybe ahead of time how often that's the case. And it's a little different from promises because promises as written are usually designed to execute only once. Obviously, there's ways to make them execute over time, but the whole idea of RxJS is to think more about things as continuous streams that happen at any given time. So this is recommended by the Angular team as sort of an optional add-on for the framework, but they do recommend that you use it. And so, again, we were torn a little bit. Do we want to use this? Do we not? But we finally figured, like, frankly, this is probably our best opportunity to try this out. It's unlikely that we're going to bring this into any other project. So we really want to see why the team recommends this. If you've never seen it or worked with it before, it's going to hurt your brain a lot. And actually, you should go to Ken's talk tomorrow because he's going to help you understand it a lot better. But it is incredibly powerful. It's worth trying to use it. And the good news is there's kind of a lot of hype and momentum around the library at the moment. So if you're stuck, there's probably like 10 other people who are wrestling with the exact same thing. And so Google and Stack Overflow are really going to be your friends when you try to work with this. But the thing to realize here is, again, it's optional, and if you're just starting out with an Angular project and you're feeling overwhelmed about the amount of new stuff that you have to learn already, it is by far like the easiest part of the stack to kind of do away with. So don't feel bad if you say, like, this is probably just too much for me to learn right now. And just because you don't use it now doesn't mean you can't use it in the future. You can always bring it in basically when you're ready to learn something new. And the biggest benefit of RxJS is being able to take advantage of this thing called the async pipe. And so the whole idea is here this is an example from the Angular website, but in order to kind of visualize this, think about, for example, like a chat app, maybe using WebSockets. So somebody on one computer sends a message and someone on the other computer wants to be able to immediately see the message that they sent. So in a very naive world, we wouldn't know perhaps when that message has changed or when a new message has come in. So what we would do is basically just render this particular template over and over again, not having the intelligence to say, like, oh, this message has changed, I need to render a new thing on the screen. And that re-rendering is really what takes up a fair amount of CPU and what slows down your app. So what RxJS allows you to do is that the core component is this thing called an observable. And that's what the message is right here. A common convention that you'll see is people will put a $sign at the end of the variable name to indicate that it's an observable, because once you start writing your app, it's very easy to start forgetting when things are observables versus when they are just regular variables. So the message here is an observable, and I put that in my template directly and then use the async pipe, which is a built-in part of the Angular framework. And so the whole idea here is that this basically allows Angular to take advantage of the fact that it can now say, just notify me when I get a new message, and at that point I will update the template, and if not, I'm just not going to do anything. And that's really what allows the newer versions of Angular to have drastically improved web app performance. So that kind of leads into state management. For those who are not familiar with that term, it's really what about the whole idea of managing data within our application. And it was an idea that was popularized by Redux. And you can, in fact, use Redux with Angular. A lot of people have done so and had a lot of success with it. But we had already decided we want to try out RxJS. And in many ways, Redux kind of duplicates functionality already provided by RxJS. You might have picked up on when I was explaining what RxJS does, is that it's a very similar idea of thinking of things as a series of events that you want to have predictable outcomes. So we decided, yes, we want to make something that has Redux-like functionality, but we want to take advantage of RxJS, not duplicate it. And so we found this library called ngrxstore, which is also, I believe, going to be in Ken's presentation tomorrow, so you'll learn more about it there. But just to give a brief idea of what that looks like, our final project structure, we have this feature called Explore that's organized this way. We have Explore Actions, Explore Components, Explore Module, Explore Reducer, Explore Service, and then just our styles. And that's really about it. And the reducer looks like this. For those of you who haven't used Redux before, it's essentially just a glorified switch statement that takes in as its case the action type and then returns a new copy of state. And so this is basically exactly the same thing. You might see I'm importing reducer and action here from ngrxstore, but those are actually just interfaces, which are technically optional, really only like there if you're using TypeScript, so you can ignore them if you want to. And if you drop those, you have just essentially a pure Redux reducer. And actions work pretty much exactly the same way. Again, I'm importing action here, but it's just an interface. So I have explore actions, which is essentially a static class. Here is an example of an action. It's a function called load that takes in an optional parameter called channel. And then it just returns the action object, which has by default by definition a type and then an optional payload. So again, there's nothing in here that's Angular or RxJS specific. This is following the same Flux standard actions convention that the Redux community uses as well. So where really like the Angular magic comes in is in your ng module. Nginx store comes with this thing called the store module, which you add to your imports in the module. So you use store module.forRoot, and then you pass it an object that is essentially just a combination of all of your different reducers. So we have more than just these three, but in order to fit them on the screen, I just use these three. So explore, nav, and player, you pass those into store module.forRoot, and that's your store. And then you can essentially, after doing that, use store anywhere you want in anything that's in this module. So a very primitive example of this from the Nginx store example is that you might have an app component. Your store has something called a counter, which is just a simple counter from like 0 to whatever infinite number. So the whole idea here is that the store, instead of returning just a counter, returns an observable of the counter. So I can save that to a public variable and then access it in my template with the async pipe. And then as a result, this template will only be re-rendered anytime that the counter changes. So that's really putting all of the magic together, and that's all it is. So it's super simple and great. And so if you remember our hypothesis, React and Angular share many of the same core ideas, and there's a place in every team stack for both. We think that we proved our hypothesis correct. Thanks in large part to our decision to use ES6 and the Redux flag state management plugin, the React developers were able to participate in all of our code reviews and can help maintain this code in the future. But for us, we felt like Angular was the best choice we could have picked for this particular project because it was an all-in-one framework and because it had the superior testing infrastructure that was critical to our success. Some miscellaneous tips and tricks that I wasn't sure where else they fit in the presentation. Obviously, now that Angular's been out for quite a while, there's a lot better resources than there were a year ago, but I think these, which were around a year ago, are probably still helpful today. Our favorite one was Victor Savkin's blog. Victor Savkin was a core member of the Angular team, and he has this blog that has these posts which explore some of the kind of like theoretical concepts behind Angular 2 and up, but really explains them in like human readable text rather than like what sounds like a computer science textbook. And he has these great diagrams to really help visualize what's happening. So this is a great read if you're struggling with some of the core ideas of the framework. If you want to try your hand at RxJS but are just having trouble understanding like what the big deal with observables even is, there's the blog type post by Andre Staltz called The Introduction to Reactive Programming You've Been Missing. It's a GitHub gist, so there's no like good short URL, but you can just do a search for this on Google, Andre Staltz Reactive Programming, and you'll probably find this. And it's a great read because again, it uses kind of very simple examples to help walk you through some difficult theoretical concepts. The team at Angular class has an Angular 2 Webpack starter, which is great to look over if you've got some sort of like configuration type issues that you're trying to wrestle through with Webpack. They have some fairly detailed examples of like advanced things to do, like setting up AOT. So that's great. That being said, again, if you're starting a new project, the Angular CLI is probably the best place to start. But this is a great place for advanced help. And then Angular class also has this list called Awesome Angular 2, which is a curated list of great Angular resources, anything from like blog posts to tutorials to plugins, example projects that people have done, you name it. So it's great both if you're trying to find help with something or if you're just looking for inspiration for a project. On the topic of plugins, it's important to note that AngularJS plugins are generally incompatible with Angular versions 2 and up. Again, the API changed enough that there's really no way to use these together. And many of the popular UI plugins like Material and Bootstrap are still in alpha or beta release stage. That being said, I think most of them now are fairly close to final, but it's still worth being aware that there might be a little bit more churn. And then finally, most of those plugins for Angular are now focusing all of their development and their documentation on TypeScript. So again, like if you're wrestling with like, should I really use TypeScript or not, this might be another good reason why. If you want to be able to copy paste code from someone's tutorial into your app and then modify it, use the language that they're using. I know I've talked a lot about testing without showing examples, and this is because there's not a ton involved in Angular testing that's different from testing for any other framework other than just the fact that it uses dependency injection by default. So that allows you to make everything individually unit testable. And the other good news is that if you are AngularJS users and you're familiar with its testing stack, it really hasn't changed for the new version. The default stack is still Jasmine and Karma for unit tests and Jasmine and Protractor for the end-to-end tests. But you can also use Mocha or Cucumber or whatever else you want to use. There was a popular Angular convention that you put your unit test next to source code. So if you think back to that example I used earlier of like a profile module, where you have like a profile component, you would probably call your unit test file profile.component.spec.js. And so keep your test next to your source code. It's a really nice way to kind of make your project more maintainable. And Protractor, the end-to-end testing framework, is now also focusing a lot of its development on TypeScript. So yet again, another reason to make the switch if you needed more motivation. There's also these really cool libraries called NativeScript and React Native that essentially allow you to use Angular to write apps that compile down into native iOS and Android and soon Universal Windows projects, which is really awesome because you can basically like build an app you can ship to the App Store without having to ever write a single line of Objective-C or Java. One thing I do want to note though is that you can't just use a regular Angular web app. Among other things, one thing you'll have to do is rewrite all of your templates because iOS and Android use XML. So you probably can't do all of this from a single code base. You would probably have to have like a fork or another version for NativeScript or React Native. And as you may have picked up on for React Native, yes, this is a React library. However, there is a wrapper that will allow you to use React Native with Angular. All that being said, it's kind of just a couple people's passion project right now, and so it's not particularly well maintained. I'm still hopeful that it'll pick up more steam in the future, because I think personally that it's really cool that these two communities might come together to work on something and make it really great. But in the meantime, there is NativeScript, and NativeScript is awesome. It's a really fun thing to play around with, like if you're just looking for a passion project, something to hack on the weekend or something like that. And their documentation is like the best I've ever seen for any technical project ever, and I don't say that lightly, so props to them for that. And finally, if you're using AngularJS but you just don't feel ready to upgrade, the most important thing is at least start using AngularJS versions 1.5 and up and start writing your code in components. And another big thing that you can do to get yourself ready is switching from Gulp or Grunt to Webpack or Browserify if you haven't done that already. And then when you are ready, there's this upgrade guide on the Angular webpage, which is really great. And this is actually, I think, really useful even if you are not actively trying to upgrade an app. But if you have AngularJS experience and you're just trying to wrap your head around truly like what changed and what would I need to do differently to write in the newer versions of Angular, read through this and it'll really help you understand that. And so in conclusion, 1 year with Angular at NPR, 2 thumbs up to Angular. It's been great for us. We would not have made that decision differently. Angular 2 and ES6, we feel kind of met about. Knowing what we know now, we probably would have picked TypeScript. And TypeScript, I was really hoping that there was an emoji that was like drooling, because that's like the thing that I am most looking forward to when we get back to working on this project is upgrading everything to TypeScript so we can take advantage of AOT. System.js was kind of a disappointment. Webpack has been pretty good, but Webpack is the sort of thing where like sometimes it feels like trying to open a beer bottle with a Swiss Army knife. Kind of makes your head spin a little bit. And Angular CLI is awesome, and it was like the one thing that I wish had been there a year ago when we did this. But obviously all of you nowadays get to take advantage of it, so that's great. Dependency injection, I think, is still one of the things that makes Angular really powerful and really cool, because it's what really powers up your unit testing. And Protractor, I think, is probably, at least for us internally, the biggest selling point for Angular to like stakeholders, to people in management. They can say like, hey, like we don't need a QA person on our team, we can write our own end-to-end test. And that's huge for us. RxJS is great, but definitely like just like hurts your brain so much when you're starting out with it. An NGRX store, this might look like a very modest smile, but it's supposed to emphasize that it really is kind of very simple, but so powerful. And then finally, the Angular team, like I have nothing but love and respect for them, and they are great. And if anything at the start of my presentation sounded like criticism of them, it's definitely not. It was meant to emphasize that I think it all turns. They have gone above and beyond to really try to incorporate feedback from the community to come up with both like the best framework that we could possibly have based on the technology that's available for us, but also give people what they need. So I think that they have handled everything with grace, and I really look forward to seeing what they come out with in the future. And so that's all I have, and I actually have 10 minutes for questions, which I was not expecting. Yeah, I think she's going to come out.
Whoa, that's really loud. Is there a story for server-side rendering with Angular, or is that the ahead-of-time compilation? How does that all?
That ahead-of-time compilation is different. There is a separate project for server-side rendering called Angular Universal, which again, a year ago, it was like in pre-alpha stage, so we were too afraid to touch it. I think it's gotten a lot better since then. I think they've gotten a lot more people involved in the project, so it's moved a lot faster. I can't remember off the top of my head if they're at final or close, but if they're not at final, I think they're close. And so that's a great tool. We ended up building our own proxy using PHP to do like what we needed for server-side rendering, and it was, again, this is one of those things where like if we had just waited a year, everything would have probably been easier, but that's what the price you pay for being on the bleeding edge, I guess.
Yeah, that is loud. Getting from a homegrown legacy app to either 1.5 or 2, 3, 4, what would be your recommendation?
I would say if you're starting a project nowadays, go straight to 4.
And I guess should you just take the leap and rewrite, or is there a migration path? More headache to try to mix?
I think it depends a little bit on the use case. Frankly, like I would say again, because my philosophy is there's no one framework to rule them all. If you're working with truly like legacy code, that rewriting everything from scratch is not an easy option, then React might be a better choice just because it allows you to pick out individual parts that you rewrite without committing to rewriting the whole thing. Angular is very much more about like, we give you everything, but as a result, you kind of also have to buy into the system. So rewriting everything probably is the easiest way to go.
Some of our version 1 Angular apps, we had a lot of dependencies on frameworks and supporting libraries like Angular UI or later on Angular Material. And one of the reasons why we didn't jump right into 2.0 as soon as it came GA was because all these other frameworks were just in alpha, some in beta, and things like that. And we just chose not to like try to build all that stuff ourselves, only to find 6 months later or a year later, well, they're already built, and it's just less code base for us to maintain. Mm-hmm. Have you found that these other frameworks and things have now caught up, or?
Yeah, I think all of them are, like I said, like Angular Material in particular, I think is like in beta or release candidate. They're very, very close. And the good thing about that team is that they work so closely with the Angular core team at Google that I think even though they're not comfortable calling themselves final, they are working with the latest versions of Angular and bringing in new features all the time, depending on when the core team releases it. The other thing I will say about Angular UI is I think a lot of things that were built into Angular UI are actually no longer necessary because Angular now gives you the tools by default. So I do think one of the benefits of the newer versions is that you'll probably find that you'll need fewer other libraries and things like that for kind of like advanced UI UX type features. Like the router, one of the reasons why it took them 3 revisions to get to the version that they need is because they actually took feedback from the community that had worked on UI router, which had been an alternative to the default routers that ship with AngularJS. And they said, like we want to build a router that's usable for people who have both types of use cases. And that's what they ended up with. So that's, again, like one of the things you'll find is probably you'll need less libraries with the newer version. All right, if there's no other questions, I do have some NPR1 swag with me, some stickers and buttons, so if you'd like those, just come up and ask. And feel free to, come find me later, email me, find me on Twitter. And NPR also has a developer blog at npr.code, so I would love for you to check that out and let us know what you think.